I am very happy that the World Bank is not as powerful as it once was. Everybody else saw sense in what we needed to do in this project. So the World Bank walked away, the African Development Bank stepped in writing. Right? And even if the World Bank walked away, the European Investment Bank was very happy to progress with this project. The project is too large for a country like Kenya. Excuse me? A country like Kenya cannot put up a 310 megawatt plant, which is wind. Why? And yet you do have plants of that nature in Europe, in North America, in Asia, in the Middle East. Why not Africa? Early investors, they were the entrepreneurs, the actual entrepreneurs, the promoters, led by the Karlov and Wagenen group, who was able to collect a bunch of Dutch investors, especially farmers' money, people who understand wind power. The reason why these people are able to put their money in, because in the Netherlands, they have wind farms, smaller wind farms, so they know how it works.
Welcome back to the Turbines of Marsabit, a podcast on what it took to build Africa's largest wind farm. On this second episode, I'm still joined by Mugo Kibati, the outgoing chairman of Lake Turkana Wind Power. Mugo, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Paul.
The World Bank dropped the ball and said no to this project. What was the impact of that, and how did that affect your fundraising?
Let me just put it bluntly, right? I am very happy that the World Bank is not as powerful as it once was. Everybody else saw sense in what we needed to do in this project. So the World Bank walked away, the African Development Bank stepped in writing. Right? And even if the World Bank walked away, the European Investment Bank was very happy to progress with this project. You ask me, you tell me, right? What is the rationale? The issue was risk. You're not willing to take a risk. And if no one is willing to take a risk, we shall never develop this country. Okay? Thank God that the African Development Bank and these other people were willing, especially the equity investors were willing to take a risk, and they did. And the risk they took paid off.
All right. There has to have been some economic diplomacy. There has to have been government support. What was it like at that time when you were actually starting the fundraising journey for this project?
Well, $1 billion is a lot of money. And I know that we live in a world where we see billions being discussed in our newspapers. $1 billion is a lot of money. And at the time, it was somewhere in the range of 75 to 100 billion Kenya shillings equivalent at the time, at the exchange rate of that time. But $1 billion is roughly, in euros, is what was required to bring this project to fruition. A project that had several components in it. And to raise $1 billion, and remember, nobody, no serious players have $1 billion sitting in some account somewhere. Not people who have actually made that money and had earned. They make sure that their money is somewhere working, sweating for them. And so to raise $1 billion, you must have a credible, bankable project. You must be able to convince investors and bankers that you'll be able to prudently use that money and repay them on time. And for the investors, you'll repay them with healthy returns. For the bankers, you'll repay them plus the interest. And you can't just do a roadshow and tell stories without putting documents on the table that are credible. You must be able to explain to your investors and to bankers, I'm putting up a 310 megawatt power plant, which is a wind power plant, which is going to be the largest on the continent, in an area that does not have any roads to speak of, which does not have any grid. The closest grid where there'll be off-take is 400 kilometers away. and therefore give them a credible plan as how you're going to do this. And so an enabling environment is critical. That you have a Kenya Power Lighting company that was credible, that had a balance sheet, that was convincing enough to investors that they would be able to pay for the power they'll be receiving. You need to be able to have a sovereign environment that people believe in. People need to believe that I put $1 billion into Kenya, this facility will not be expropriated or nationalized. When I need to get my dollars out of the country, I will be able, there will be facilitation for me to get my dollars as an investor sitting in the UK, sitting in Finland, in Norway, in Germany, in South Africa, in the US. We had investors from all over. And that sovereign environment, that guarantee that Kenya is a kind of a nation where laws are respected. It's a country of laws. It's a country that respects investors. Is important. Kenya Power Lighting Company was able to demonstrate its ability to take up that power and to pay for it. The Kenyan government issued a guarantee to the Africa Development Bank on the transmission line, because the transmission line was outside the scope of Lake Turkana Power Project. By the time we were breaking ground, it was a responsibility of the government of Kenya to make sure that a transmission line was constructed between Loyangalani and Suswa, the 428 kilometers, and to be constructed in good enough time that by the time the power plant was ready, the transmission line would be available to offtake power.
So before then, just help me understand, what really do you start with, and where do you start when you're doing this fundraising?
And I think, Paul, allow me,
Yeah.
because I've just spoken about us. You asked a question about fundraising, and the only aspect I've spoken to is the credibility that you have to demonstrate to the fundraisers. I think it's important that I go a little beyond that and talk about the fact that you've got different sources of funds. Yeah. You have the equity investors. They are the ones who take the maximum risk. Okay? They are the ones who are the promoters of the project. They have to put skin in the game. Sort of the $1 billion, about a quarter of it is equity. Was actually people who took money out of their pockets, $250 million, and took the risk of investing in this project. And then the other, the balance, the 3/4, is they had to borrow the money. And, bankers borrow on guarantees. Equity investors, the shareholders, take risk. If the project sinks, they go under and they lose their money. But bankers rarely, if ever, give any loans, any debt without guarantees, because they want to be repaid. And I think it's important for people to understand the components of an investment, what it takes to raise money and apply it to a project that you have aspects that you have no control of, especially projects that require government intervention. So, for instance, in this particular case, who buys the power? Kenya Power Lighting Company, a government entity. Who is building the transmission line? Ketraco, another government entity, which you have no control of. And if they delay in building the transmission line, then that means you'll not be able to repay your bankers. And bankers take no prisoners. They say, you're going to pay us $750,000 over a specific period of time. And the first installment is on date X. And if you don't pay that first installment on date X, interest accrues, penalties accrue. If you continue not to pay, you could even have some of your guarantees called, and your equity goes down the drain. And projects as complex as power plants, highways, ports, airports, that are risky. Governments, national policy makers must be able to give comfort to investors who are risking their equity to be able to go raise the balance of funds they require to complete complex projects that this country needs.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that conversation is a bit complicated and complex, and we have a lot of demagoguery that goes on that makes it even more complex to explain to citizens and to Kenyans and to people, the layman, how difficult it is to secure an investor. So in the case of Lake Turkana,
Yeah.
the early investors, they were the entrepreneurs, the actual entrepreneurs, the promoters, led by the Carlo van Wagenen group, who was able to collect a bunch of Dutch investors, especially farmers. It's farmers' money, people who understand wind power. The reason why these people are able to put their money in, because in the Netherlands, they have wind farms, smaller wind farms, so they know how it works. Yes, we did have the hiccup of the delayed transmission line, but eventually transmission line was built.
Yeah.
And I have to say that even for the dim guaranteed energy that had to be paid as a penalty because of the delayed transmission line for the, to pay the bankers, the savings this country has seen since we commissioned in 2018, they're much more significant than the DGEs. The DGE payments pale in comparison.
Yeah.
Over 60 billion shillings and counting, just the first 6 years. We've got another 14 years, right? 60 billion shillings savings in the replacement of fuel-generated energy. In other words, if Lake Turkana power plant did not exist since 2018, KPLC would have paid an additional 60 billion shillings for the fuel
Buy power
energy.
and sell to Kenyans.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that would have been transferred to Kenyans.
Yeah.
That is not spoken about. Okay? And what is more, it's renewable energy. It's green energy. It puts us on the green energy map and allows Kenya to contribute to the global target, right, of reducing, climate, the climate impact to 1.5 to less than 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. The COP target.
Yeah.
We are a major contributor to that. These are intangible, unspoken of benefits that put us on the map as good global country or sovereign citizens. And we have a responsibility as a nation, as Kenyan citizens, but also as global citizens, to participate in ensuring that our children and grandchildren have a world in which climate change is not impacting them and causing all sorts of floods and heat waves and killing people. And so when I see the conversation around Lake Turkana wind power, it's disappointing, but I understand.
Yeah.
I perfectly understand the suspicion and the concerns Kenyans have, because as I said earlier, we have not had the kind of transparency that we should have. In the case of Lake Turkana, when it comes to transparency, I read media reports. Yeah. Some of them have banded all sorts of names to me, and yet as chairman, I am not a shareholder, never been, not an executive. I'm chairman of the board, or have been chairman of the board, oversighted the development of this project, but not as a shareholder. Governance doesn't allow. Good corporate governance that doesn't allow the chairman to be a shareholder. In fact, Lake Turkana governance documents were very clear. The shareholders agreed that the board chairman would be independent, non-shareholding, non-executive. And for the longest time, actually up to date, I remained the only independent, non-executive, non-shareholding, non-voting chairman.
Yeah.
In fact, my job on the board is to make sure the right decisions are arrived at and to guide them. But for me, the benefit is to see the project come to fruition, right? We have had, from the date of financial close, communicated on our website, everything, who the shareholders are, who the bankers are, the whole works. Unlike a lot of other IPPs, if there's one IPP project that has been as transparent as possible into ownership and debt and how much you have raised and how much you have spent and spoken about it in publicly ad nauseum, it has been Lake Turkana Wind Power project. But they also trusted, Carlo, they trusted that everybody will do their bit All the various parts of the ecosystem will do their bit in order for them to get their equity investment. And so only then would you then be able to go to other potential equity investors, because to raise $250 million, you need a lot of shareholders.
Yeah.
Nobody has that. Very few people in this world have that kind of money. I mean, you're not talking about Elon Musk here, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about your average investor. And so the other equity participants who came in and whom I must thank profusely were development finance institutions.
Yeah.
Norfund out of Norway, FinFund out of Finland, IFE out of the Netherlands. People who put money at risk. We have other, by the way, development partners who are not willing to put their money at risk.
Yeah, this must have been a complex and a big project.
Yes, it's complex, but FinFund is putting their money in, so what's the difference? I mean, the thing is, if you're a development partner and you claim that you have risk money to contribute, then contribute it as risk money, right? And so I must say that some of our development partners from Finland, government of Finland, government of Norway, the Netherlands, they're being able to put money as equity money, not debt, risk equity money, convinced other shareholders and convinced the banks that, okay, and we had to go to very credible banks, European Investment Bank, Africa Development Bank, East African Development Bank, Propaco, DEG. These are all A-grade global institutions that this project was able to convince to lend money to build the $1 billion. And again, I speak about this process because with what I see sometimes thrown about, billion here, billion there, everybody thinks that,
it's easy money.
It's easy money. And I think it's unfortunate that those people who painstakingly do the hard work of getting the legitimate money the hard way, the proper way, don't get the kudos that they deserve. But in this case, over a period of over 5-6 years, the process of fundraising systematically took place, starting with the equity investors, the promoters, then with the development finance institutions that also put in their equity and give credibility, and then with the debt institutions, the European Investment Bank and AFDB and EADB, Nedbank, Standard Bank, South Africa. It was a very complex financial structure, I can assure you.
Yeah.
In fact, in 2015, we were awarded Renewable Energy Deal of the Year at the British Museum of Natural History by Thomas Reuters. And because it was a complex structure to get a project of this nature, this costly, off the ground in a remote part of an African country like Kenya, but in a remote part of Kenya, and get a structure that actually gets the funds raised and the project off the ground. And people played different actors played their bit. And so anyway, financial close eventually happened in 2014.
You went out for roadshows, and
yes.
You were marketing this project.
Yes.
And many investors came on board, but I'm sure some turned you down.
I wouldn't say many investors came on board. No, it was very difficult to secure investors. Many investors didn't come easily on board. That's why it took 6 years, because there were a lot of skeptics, right? Just recently, and I'm going to wade into this controversial territory because I saw a debate between the IMF and the World Bank about our current debt situation in this country. And the IMF was supportive of our government's planned approach towards dealing with the debt, and the World Bank was raising issues. Well, excuse me, this is not new. And you know that IMF is more European related, and the World Bank is more US related. And I'm sorry, we've had an issue when it comes to the US and any risk on this continent, hesitancy. If they had their way, they only want to do the easy things that are not going to, you will keep building things in Nairobi and Mombasa and Nakuru because there you have the infrastructure. There you have the human capital. There you have the experience. And whereas in parts of Kenya that we must develop, it's too risky. But Finland, Norway, the Netherlands, Denmark, through Vestas, came to the party, right? And so when I see these debates even today, I tend to think that maybe the fact that the Europeans colonized us in an ironic
twist
has helped them understand this continent a lot better than their counterparts across the Atlantic who, were never colonizers, but boy, when we became independent, they really don't understand what it takes to invest in a country like Kenya on this continent and are very risk averse.
Yeah.
So when we were fundraising, the fact that some of these development finance partners came in with equity helped de-risk the project so that the $750 million required to be borrowed, banks such as the EIB, European Investment Bank, had the confidence to loan this project the money.
What are some of those questions that most of these investors were asking? What were the issues?
As I said, I think I've spoken to the issues of the fact that it's too, the project is too large for a country like Kenya. Excuse me? A country like Kenya cannot put up a 310 megawatt plant, which is wind. Why? And yet you do have plants of that nature in Europe, in North America, in Asia, in the Middle East. Why not Africa? Right? 30, 40 years ago, Dubai never had any kind of cities and skyscrapers, but somebody had to start. And you got to start somewhere. And from a Vision 2030 perspective, if we said we can't do big things, then, forget Vision 2030. So basically the challenges were too remote, it's never been done before, too big. Can Kenya consume that power? Where will the offtake be? Excuse me. We're an industrialized nation hoping to be a middle-income country by 2030. Of course, we would need copious amounts of energy, huge amounts of energy, And so to say that there'll be no offtake for 300 megawatts, when a country that's like South Africa with a population of 50 million people was at 40,000 megawatts, and now they have not enough power, we are complaining about going to 2,000 megawatts, and yet we want to industrialize. And these are some of the disconnects sometimes in our conversations with development partners and even with policymakers and with our fellow Kenyans. Understand, because if we're going to be, a $250 billion GDP economy by 2030, we need thousands and thousands of megawatts because the manufacturing facilities that we need. If you look at the standard gauge railway line, the one that is being built has been built and to be built all the way to Kampala, and the one to be built in Lapset in the northern part of the country. Ideally, they should be electric trains.
Yeah.
But today they are diesel powered because you don't have power. So countries that have transformed have made bold moves by bold policymakers. Mahathir Mohamad in Malaysia had to tell off the US. And that's why Malaysia became what it became in the 90s.
Yeah.
Dubai, you name it. Singapore, I earlier spoke about Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. He had to do the same thing. So why should we in Africa, with our vision, in Kenya, for instance, be told, no, you guys probably can't do this. And to my disappointment, and this is why I think we need to do our own soul searching as Kenyans, some of our own, brothers let us down, and because there was no reason why Ketraco could not have done in 2015 what they eventually did in 2018. The transmission line was also another, there was no transmission line. So that was seen as a risk. And that is why the financial construct, the bankers insisted, we will not loan this project money unless we have a government guarantee. Or rather, we have a guarantee from the African Development Bank that if the transmission line is not ready by the time this plant is complete, then we'll be paid our money. And the FDB issued that guarantee. And the government of Kenya supported that guarantee as members of the African Development Bank. Every African country is a member of the African Development Bank. And that was the only way to raise the $750,000 in debt required to do this project. So when in 20, and I'll go to this, Paul, if you'll allow me, when in 2016, rather in 2017, we completed the project. And unfortunately, despite our protestations to Ketraco and to the Ministry of Energy, because we could see what was happening, the transmission line was not done. And we as Lake Turkana tried to buy as much time as possible. January, February, March, April, all the way until May, saying, look, we should be, they're calling a guarantee as early as January, but look, our intention is not to call guarantees. Our intention is to get the project online. So can you please do something?
Yeah.
Nothing was happening. And so unfortunately, the bankers were not to be trifled with.
Yeah.
They needed their first installment payment in September of 2017. A massive installment payment of 37 million euros. And that money had to come from somewhere. And this is why, and the bankers had guaranteed that that they would be paid through the African Development Bank. And the government, I think, prudently made good to make sure that that debt was paid and that the plant, which was now ready, was able to be operational because, you are 365 turbines and they need to be serviced almost on a weekly basis in terms of they have to run even if they're not connected to the grid, and that costs money. You need engineers, you need all that stuff. And the government prudently said, look, our entity, government-owned entity, which was supposed to put up the transmission line, hasn't done its bit, and now the bankers need their money. The equity investors, the shareholders,
they're waiting.
They have to wait.
Yeah.
They don't get a penny.
Yeah.
Right? But the bankers have to get their money because if you don't pay the bankers, they call the debt. If they call the debt, FDB now declares, a default, an event of default on the country. And so the government prudently made sure that money was paid. And that is what caused a lot of challenges with what people call the deemed guaranteed energy payments.
Yeah.
Because that payment, even though it is being paid so that a debt installment can be paid, is actually paid on the basis of what would the plant, if the transmission line was connected, have been deemed to generate, right? And so because the shareholders agreed to delay the calling of the guarantee as negotiated, and the government prudently did what it was supposed to do, the shareholders lost value. And this has never been understood.
Yeah.
That the bankers, they got their money. But the shareholders lost value because even though they were owed a lot more money than what the debt requirement was, they agreed to delay their revenues by 6 years. So what should have been paid in full wasn't paid in full. The deemed guaranteed energy by the contract, as per contract. What was paid was just what was necessary to repay the loan and to run the operations of this wind power plant. It's 40,000 acres.
Yeah.
There's 110 kilometers in between the turbines that have to be serviced.
110
kilometers of road. I think it's difficult for people to fathom what it takes, how big this project is, and what it takes to run it. And once you've built it, you must run it. You have 300 employees, who must be paid. Salaries must be paid. So these shareholders, as I earlier explained, the equity investors are the ones who take the risk. They took the hit. Yeah. But a lot of people thought they got the money because people don't understand financial structuring, that this money was earmarked towards mostly debt and the operations of the company. Yeah. Any other money that was contracted to be paid in case the transmission was delayed was suspended into the future. So in the fundraising, now going back to the fundraising, if you don't take care of all those elements, especially for bankers, it's difficult to raise $1 billion. If you don't guarantee them their money, the bankers, they will not give you the money, right? And so this is why projects such as it's complex. But for countries like Kenya to transform themselves into an industrialized country we must be sophisticated enough, right? Have a policy framework, an enabling environment that allows people to put risk money into this country. And so when I see some of the and I won't get into them, but some of the conversations going on right now on PPP projects, it's a little disappointing and disturbing because it sets us back. It sets us back because we will need
To have,
private. We will need public,
have PPPs,
successful, transparent, public-private partnerships if we're to develop this country.
365 turbines. Let's talk about turbines. How do you bring 365 turbines from Denmark to
I think Paul,
Marsabit?
allow me to say that Lake Turkana Power Project, complex as it was, had to have several projects in one. Of course, the main one was to build the power plant, bring the turbines, the one you speak, and I will come to that. But you also had to build 2 power stations. One that belongs to Lake Turkana, where the power is aggregated, and a second one that belongs to Ketraco KPLC, where we transfer the power to them. That building of a power station, in and of itself, is a massive project. We also had to build a 200-kilometer road from Laisamis to Loyangalani. Smooth gravel, 200-kilometer road at the coast of Lake Turkana, which is now available for utilization by the residents of Marsabit County and anybody who is going to that part of the world. We had to build as a separate project. So a 20-kilometer road is a project in itself. We also had to build a campus where people would live. Because today we house 340 or so odd workers and employees and engineers. You have to have places, rooms where they live, houses where they live, where they eat, a clubhouse. We have to have a facility where repairs, and it's a massive facility because a turbine is a massive structure. So, a petrol station, all sorts of things had to be built so that people in that very remote place where I find goats and camels can actually comfortably live as employees and workers of Lake Turkana, right? That is a project in and of its own. Then, because of the instability of our national grid, and I think we've suffered the consequences of that in the last couple of years, we had to build a special rectification plant to stabilize the energy that comes and goes out of Lake Turkana. And then we come in now to the main project of the turbines on 40,000 acres. 365 turbines from Denmark by Vestas via Mombasa Port to Loyangalani. It's a great benefit that Vision 2030 had seen the building of the road from Isiolo to Laisamis, to Moyale via Laisamis,
yes.
right? That we had the northern bypass and the eastern bypass built and Thika Highway built. Because had we not had those roads built and they had to come through Uhuru Highway, would have had to bust up the roundabouts on Uhuru Highway. Because each turbine would require 3 wide load trucks. Each turbine between the tower and the vanes is 3 wide load trucks. 3 wide load trucks per turbine. So 3 times 365. It's a massive operation that people aren't aware of. But we did it. And then you bring them to the location via our highways, bypassing Nairobi, thank God because of the bypasses, via that Isiolo Moyale Road, thank God we built it. And that's why I say to you, Paul, transforming a nation, the different components. Without vision any that, you can't have Lake Turkana Wind Power. Because part of LAPSET was to make sure you build all those roads in that area. And then once you have them on site, the ability to be able to put them up across the 40,000 acres. We have to build roads in between the turbines and the campus. as I said earlier, 110 kilometers of roads.
Yeah.
Just to give you an idea of the scale of this project and why this project is a celebrated project globally. I have been invited to talk about it in Oslo, in London, rarely in Nairobi, except to go to Parliament to talk about DGEs. Unfortunately,
to explain
to explain our own issues are the ones that but outside there, twice I've been in Oslo, talking about renewable energy on the African continent, spearheaded by Kenya, to on international conferences on renewable energy, global conferences, and they want to hear about Lake Turkana. It's a case study. It's one of the top universities in this world, right here in this country. So, and that for me is that's the payment I get, right? So that project, those 5 or 6 odd major projects in and of themselves were complex projects, but they're all done on time and on budget in 30 months.
In 30 months. Now, take us to commissioning. You have the turbines on the ground, the journey from there all the way to commissioning.
So, commissioning ought to have happened by January of 2017. Unfortunately, without the transmission line, you couldn't commission. And so when Ketraco got their act together, and eventually they did, and within a year, they built the transmission line from Loyangalani to Suswa. Could have been done in 2015. But anyway, that's water, that's under the bridge. But in July of 2018, we were finally able to commission. Groundbreaking with the former President Uhuru Kenyatta as the chief guest happened in January of 2015. That's when there was nothing. And commissioning of the fully fledged power plant supplying power, again by President Uhuru Kenyatta, happened in July of 2018. And from then on, we began supplying at least 12% of the total grid. But depending on the time of day and the season, sometimes it goes up to 20%. So we supply between 12 to 20% of the total national power in this country. One power plant, and wind, and renewable. I think it's important to understand that wind power plants have a rating. Okay. And so when you say 310 megawatts in the case of Lake Turkana, or 25 megawatts in the case of the Ngong one, you don't typically get the full 310. There's always a power factor also associated with that rating. And that power factor is part of the power purchase agreement. Globally, the average power factor for wind plants is between 30 to 40% globally. So when you see wind plants in Copenhagen in Denmark, right, which is famous for those wind power plants, that rating is between 30 and 40% globally. Which means if it's at 40% or it's at 30%, if the rating is 25%, you should get an average of 30% of 25 megawatts. The rating for Lake Turkana is at about 60%, one of the best. And that is because of the Lake Turkana wind corridor elements. And the way Lake Turkana has operated since commissioning, especially on good days, the power factor has been pretty good. Pretty good. We have had some outstanding days of even 90%, but that's rare, It's an average. So sometimes you have 90, sometimes you have 40, and you average around the 60% mark. And that is an efficient, very efficient plant. So we have, in the last 6 years, consistently supplied 12 to 20% of what's on the national grid, consistently ensured that the national grid has wind, renewable wind energy, as a significant component of our total power, because the world is struggling. It's an existential struggle to make sure we don't overheat this planet. The 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels that we are targeting, right? And Kenya is at the top of the scheme. It's the reason why Kenya and President Ruto is a leader in climate change efforts on this continent. Lake Turkana Wind Power has put Kenya on that map. Okay, and while they say important but not urgent, because the way our human brain is conditioned is to deal with crisis, with what is imagined. If my hand is burning now, I go and bandage it and deal with it now. But preventing my hand from burning 20 years down the road is not there's something about us as human beings, we don't know how to do that. When people tell you eat healthy, so that you live long. No, I want to have my nyama choma. Then when you start getting, gout and stuff, you're like, oops, now let me stop eating meat.
It's
too late.
Yeah.
Climate change is that kind of a problem.
Yeah.
You have climate change naysayers. One has just been elected in one of the biggest nations in this world. Because you're talking about 20, 25 years down the road. But climate change has started. We have glaciers melting. When I was a kid, Mount Kenya was fully snow-covered. Today there is snow, but not as much as there was when I was a kid. And so climate change is an important existential problem that we must deal with. And I am proud that Lake Turkana is a contributor to ensuring a more a lifestyle for our progeny, grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They will ask, what was my grandfather doing? I'll be able to say, you know what? Your grandfather
you are the chairman.
Wanted you to live
It's
a good life where you're not overheating and where you can swim without floods.
Yeah.
And so anyway, since commissioning, we have done our bit as we had always projected. I only wish we had done it a year earlier, because we could have had the transmission line been ready.
10 years now. What are the lessons? What do you take away from your 10 years? What could you have done differently or better?
The management of the project was very well done. As I said earlier on time and on budget. The other maybe challenge would have been, and again, there are certain things you cannot anticipate, because the land was leased under the old Marsabit County Council government in the old constitution. And they followed the necessary procedures that Marsabit County Council used to use to lease land. The council approved it, they went through all the processes. But then when the new county government and new administration came in, and you had people objecting, frivolous, frankly speaking, because as I told you, Marsabit is a large county. And the community around the project in Loyangalani love the project.
That was Mugo Kibati telling us how a decision by the World Bank to pull out nearly killed Kenya's dream to build Africa's biggest wind farm. Coming up in our third episode, just what does it take to run Africa's largest wind farm?